Imagine standing in the blistering heat of the Egyptian desert. Right in front of you sits the Great Sphinx of Giza, the largest and most famous single-stone statue on Earth. For generations, the story has been simple, neatly packaged in our high school history books. The ancient Egyptians built it around 4,500 years ago to guard the mighty pyramids. But what if everything we thought we knew about this massive stone guardian is completely wrong? What if the Sphinx wasn't built by the pharaohs at all, but was merely found by them? Today, we are going to look at this ancient monument not through the eyes of historians reading old texts, but through the eyes of geologists, scientists who read the literal language of the rocks and the earth itself. When we look at the physical wear and tear on the Sphinx, the stone tells a shocking story. It whispers of a time when the Sahara wasn't a dry, sandy wasteland, but a lush, green landscape pounded by endless centuries of heavy, torrential rain. A time pushing back to the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before the first Egyptian civilization even existed. If the stone is telling the truth, it means human history, as we know it, has a massive, unexplained missing chapter. We are about to explore ancient weather patterns, changing stars, and buried secrets to find out who really carved this giant monument. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. Whether you're winding down for some historic sleep or just relaxing on your daily commute, remember, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Now, get comfortable and let's travel back in time. To truly grasp the magnitude of the mystery surrounding the Great Sphinx, we first have to understand the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the monument itself. If you have only ever seen it in photographs, usually framed with the Great Pyramid looming majestically in the background, it is very easy to misjudge its size. Against the vast backdrop of the desert, it can almost look like a modest statue resting calmly on the sand. But let's put it into a real-world perspective that you can easily picture. The Sphinx is massive. It measures roughly 240 feet long from its massive front paws to the tip of its tail. That is almost the exact length of a standard American football field, from one goal line to the other. From the bedrock base to the very top of its head, it stands about 66 feet tall. Imagine standing on a city sidewalk, craning your neck to look up at the roof of a 6-story apartment building. That is the height of this silent stone sentinel. Now, here is a crucial architectural detail that most people gloss over, and you absolutely need to understand this before we go any further into the mystery. The Great Sphinx was not built. It was not constructed by stacking massive blocks of stone one on top of the other, like a giant, ancient Lego set. That is how the pyramids were made, but not the Sphinx. Instead, the Sphinx was carved. It was sculpted directly out of the living bedrock of the Giza Plateau. Imagine a massive, solid limestone hill sticking naturally out of the ground. The ancient workers didn't build a statue from scratch. They dug a giant, U-shaped trench around that natural hill. They painstakingly removed thousands of tons of solid rock, digging deeper and deeper into the earth, until a massive rectangular core was left sitting in the middle of a sunken pit. Then, they carved that central block of stone into the shape of a reclining lion with a human head. This means the floor of the pit surrounding the statue is the natural bedrock, and the Sphinx is literally a continuous part of the earth itself, still physically attached to the ground it was carved from. So who ordered the creation of this colossal undertaking? If you open any standard history textbook, walk into a museum, or take a guided tour in Egypt today, you will be told a very specific, confident story. The mainstream historical narrative states that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC, during a period known as the Old Kingdom. This was the undisputed golden age of Egyptian pyramid building. According to this timeline, the monument is roughly 4,500 years old. The man credited with its creation is a pharaoh named Khafre. Khafre was a powerful ruler with a monumental legacy to uphold. His father, the Pharaoh Khufu, built the Great Pyramid, the largest of the three iconic pyramids at Giza. Not wanting to be outdone by his dad, Khafre built his own enormous pyramid right next to his father's. It is technically slightly shorter, but Khafre cleverly built it on a higher elevation of bedrock, so from most viewing angles on the ground, his pyramid actually appears taller. This ambitious, commanding pharaoh is the man textbooks say built the Sphinx. But why do historians point the finger at Khafre? Did he leave a signed architectural document? Is his name carved into the side of the statue in giant, undeniable hieroglyphs? The short answer is no. There is no contemporary inscription, no papyrus scroll, no ancient blueprint, and no diary entry from 2500 BC that says, "I, Khafre, commissioned the giant lion man." The connection between Khafre and the Sphinx is almost entirely based on circumstantial evidence. Let's break down the three main reasons mainstream historians confidently link them together. We need to look at these reasons fairly, because this is the foundation of modern Egyptology. The first piece of evidence is real estate. It comes down to location, location, location. The Sphinx does not just sit randomly in the middle of the desert. It is integrated into a larger architectural complex. If you look at an overhead map of Giza, a long, walled stone walkway called a causeway connects Khafre's pyramid down to a building situated right next to the Sphinx, known as the Valley Temple. To early archaeologists mapping the site, this layout strongly suggested that the whole area was one big, unified master plan. The logic goes like this. If Khafre built the pyramid at the top of the hill, and he built the causeway leading down to the Valley Temple, he must have also built the giant statue sitting right next to that temple to act as a guardian for his burial complex. The second piece of evidence comes from the face of the Sphinx itself. Mainstream experts have long argued that the face on the monument is a direct, deliberate portrait of Pharaoh Khafre. Now, looking at it today, the face has been heavily damaged over the centuries. Its nose is famously missing. No, it wasn't shot off by Napoleon's cannons. That is just a popular myth. The damage happened much earlier. Furthermore, the braided royal beard that once hung from its chin has broken off, with pieces of it now sitting behind glass in the British Museum in London. But despite the heavy damage, experts point to the majestic headdress. The Sphinx is wearing a Nem's headdress, the classic striped cloth headgear that pharaohs wore, sweeping back tightly behind the ears and resting squarely on the shoulders. In the mid-19th century, archaeologists excavating the Valley Temple right next to the Sphinx found a stunning, meticulously polished, life-sized statue of Khafre. It was carved from a super-hard, black stone called diorite. Because this confirmed, beautiful statue of Khafre was found so close to the Sphinx, and because both the statue and the Sphinx feature a pharaoh's headdress, the assumption was cemented. The giant, weathered stone face outside must simply be a scaled-up version of his face. The third, and perhaps most heavily debated piece of evidence, is a massive slab of pink granite located right between the massive front paws of the Sphinx. This artifact is known as the Dream Stele. A stele is basically an ancient stone billboard used by kings for public announcements, religious texts, or propaganda. The fascinating thing is that the Dream Stele wasn't put there by Khafre. It was erected over 1,000 years later, around 1400 BC, by an entirely different pharaoh named Thutmose IV. According to the text carved into the stone, before Thutmose became king, he was out hunting and fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx. At that time, the massive statue had been completely neglected and was buried up to its neck in desert sand. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, complaining about the weight of the sand and promising that if Thutmose dug it out, he would be crowned ruler of Egypt. Thutmose woke up, cleared the sand, became pharaoh, and set up this massive granite slab between the paws to brag about his divine right to rule. So, what does a billboard from 1400 BC have to do with Khafre from 2500 BC? When early modern archaeologists examined the Dream Stele in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the bottom portion of the granite was heavily eroded, flaking away from the harsh desert elements. However, on one specific line of text that was barely clinging to the rock, they found a single, isolated syllable: Khaf. They immediately assumed this was the surviving fragment of the name Khafre. Based entirely on this one syllable, they concluded that Thutmose IV was writing a dedication, acknowledging the original creator of the monument, Khafre. Case closed. The timeline was set. The textbooks were written and shipped to schools around the world. For over a century, this trio of evidence, the location near his temples, the perceived facial resemblance, and the single syllable on the Dream Stele, has been the unshakable bedrock of mainstream Egyptology. It is taught in universities worldwide as established undisputed fact. The logic seems neat, tidy, and perfectly wrapped in a bow. The Sphinx fits perfectly into the established timeline of the Old Kingdom. But science, true science, is not about blindly accepting old assumptions just because they have been repeated for 100 years. It is about constantly testing those assumptions against new data. And when a different kind of scientist, independent researchers and geologists trained to look at the Earth rather than read ancient texts, started looking closer at the Giza Plateau, this neat and tidy story began to violently unravel. What if the layout of those temples was actually built around an already existing, far more ancient Sphinx? What if independent forensic experts, comparing the Sphinx to the black diorite statue, determined that the face doesn't actually look like Khafre at all? And what if that single, crumbling syllable on the Dream Stele wasn't giving Khafre credit for building the monument, but was simply an ancient record acknowledging him for repairing a statue that was already incredibly old in his time? To find the truth, we have to stop looking at the history books and start looking at the stone itself. And what the stone reveals is terrifying to the established timeline of human history. To understand the massive crack in the mainstream historical timeline, we have to completely change our perspective. We need to stop acting like historians who are desperately looking for ancient, crumbling scrolls or misplaced hieroglyphs. Instead, we need to put on the hat of a geologist. Geology is the study of the earth, the materials it is made of, and the incredibly slow, powerful processes that change it over time. Geologists do not read ink on paper. They read the literal language of the stones. And the vocabulary of that language is a process called erosion. Erosion is simply nature's relentless way of tearing things down. It is the reason why jagged, towering mountains eventually become flat, dusty plains over millions of years. Everything on the surface of our planet is constantly being attacked by the elements, and in the case of ancient stone monuments sitting outside for millennia, the main attackers are wind and water. Here is where the mystery begins to unlock itself. Wind and water do not destroy rock in the same way. They leave behind two entirely different, unmistakable fingerprints. Even without a science degree, once you know what to look for, you can read these fingerprints just as clearly as words on a page. Let's break it down using everyday examples. First, let's talk about wind and sand erosion, scientifically known as Aeolian weathering. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a massive desert sandstorm. The wind whipping around you is not just empty air. It is carrying millions upon millions of tiny, sharp, abrasive grains of sand. When the wind blows hard across the open desert, it picks up these grains and blasts them horizontally against anything standing in its way. Think of it like a giant, invisible machine holding a piece of coarse sandpaper. If you take a piece of sandpaper and vigorously rub it side to side across a block of wood, what happens? You slowly wear away the surface. Now, imagine nature rubbing that sandpaper back and forth, horizontally, 24 hours a day, for 4,000 or 5,000 years. Or, if you have ever seen an auto mechanic use a sandblaster to strip old paint and rust off a car part, it is the exact same principle. The pressurized stream of sand cuts sideways. When wind and sand hit a giant piece of limestone, they attack it horizontally. Limestone is a sedimentary rock, meaning it was formed over millions of years as ancient oceans compressed layers of mud, shells, and sediment on top of each other. It looks like a giant, rocky layer cake. Some of these layers are naturally softer, and some are harder. When the horizontal wind hits this layer cake, it eats away the soft layers much faster than the hard layers. The visual result is a distinct, horizontal banding. The rock ends up looking like a stack of differently sized pancakes, with deep horizontal grooves cut into the sides, and all the sharp corners perfectly rounded off by the endless buffing of the sand. This horizontal rounding is the undeniable signature of the desert. Now, let's completely flip the script. Let's turn off the wind, take away the sand, and turn on the water. We are not talking about a light afternoon drizzle. We are talking about heavy, relentless, torrential downpours. Water erosion works on a totally different axis. While wind cuts horizontally, water cuts vertically. It operates on the simple, unstoppable law of gravity. Water always wants to go down. Imagine taking a large block of soap and setting it on the floor of your shower. If you turn the shower head on full blast directly over the soap and leave it there for an hour, what happens? The water doesn't shave the soap off in neat, horizontal layers. Instead, the falling water hits the top, gathers together, and runs down the sides. As it streams downward, it carves little vertical channels into the soap. This is exactly what happens to stone when it is subjected to heavy rainfall over thousands of years. As torrential rain pounds the earth, the water pools on top of the rock and then cascades down the sides. As it falls, it digs into the stone, finding the weakest paths and carving them out. Over centuries, these little pathways become deep, vertical trenches. If you go to a place with heavy rainfall and look at a natural rock cliff, you will see this signature clearly. You will find deep, vertical fissures, U-shaped crevices, and an undulating, wavy pattern that looks like the rock has been deeply scalloped from top to bottom. It looks like a giant set of claws reached down from the sky and scraped the sides of the stone vertically. This difference is the golden key to unlocking the secret of the Giza Plateau. To recap our crash course in geology, wind and sand act like a horizontal saw, cutting sideways, hollowing out soft layers, and leaving rounded horizontal bands. Rainwater acts like a series of vertical chisels, slicing straight down from the sky, carving deep, jagged, vertical scars and fissures into the stone. Once you understand this simple, fundamental difference, you possess the tools to read the ancient weather history of any stone monument on Earth. You do not need to be an academic to see it. You just need your own two eyes. If you walk around the Giza Plateau today and look at the Great Pyramids, or the temples, or the tombs scattered across the sand, they all tell a consistent story. They are heavily weathered, yes, but they display the classic horizontal rounding caused by millennia of wind and sand exposure. They look exactly like structures that have sat in a dry, windy desert for 4,500 years. But what happens when we take these exact same geological rules, walk over to the Great Sphinx, and look down into the massive excavated trench surrounding its body? When independent geologist Dr. Robert Schoch finally stood in that pit in the early 1990s and looked at the walls enclosing the Sphinx, he didn't see the horizontal scraping of the desert wind. He saw something entirely different. He saw a physical impossibility staring him right in the face, a pattern of erosion that shattered the established timeline of human history. Let's return to that massive U-shaped trench carved out of the bedrock on the Giza Plateau. If you want to solve the mystery of the Great Sphinx, you actually have to stop looking at the Sphinx itself for a moment. Instead, you need to turn your back to the giant lion and look at the walls of the pit surrounding it. Why? Because the Sphinx itself has been heavily repaired, patched, and reconstructed with modern and ancient stone blocks over the last few millennia. The original rock has been covered up. But the massive limestone walls of the enclosure, the literal rock face that was exposed when the ancient builders dug down to carve the statue, have been left mostly untouched by human hands. They stand exactly as nature has worn them down. In the early 1990s, an independent researcher named John Anthony West noticed something strange about these walls. He wasn't a formally trained geologist, but he had a keen eye and a relentless curiosity. He brought his observations to Dr. Robert Schoch, a highly credentialed geology professor at Boston University. Dr. Schoch was initially skeptical. He knew the textbook said the monument was 4,500 years old, built by Pharaoh Khafre. But when he actually traveled to Egypt, stood in that trench, and looked at the enclosure walls with the trained eyes of a geologist, his skepticism vanished. He did not see the harsh, horizontal scraping of the desert wind. He saw the exact opposite. The walls surrounding the Great Sphinx are deeply scarred with massive, vertical fissures. We are not talking about superficial little scratches on the surface of the rock. These are wide, undulating, U-shaped channels gouged directly into the limestone. Some of these vertical crevices are so large and so deep that a grown adult could comfortably stand inside them. To Dr. Schock, and to dozens of geologists who have reviewed his work since, the physical evidence was unmistakable. This specific pattern of deeply scalloped vertical trenching is the textbook geological signature of one thing, and one thing only: precipitation-induced weathering. In plain, everyday English, that means heavy, prolonged, torrential rainfall. Let's visualize exactly how this damage occurred. The Giza Plateau is not perfectly flat. It has a slight natural slope. Imagine thousands of years of heavy rain pouring down from the sky onto this sloping landscape. The rainwater hits the ground, gathers into massive sheets of runoff, and rushes downhill. As this rushing water reaches the edge of the deeply excavated Sphinx pit, it has nowhere to go but down. It cascades over the edge of the enclosure walls like a series of violent, miniature waterfalls. Over centuries, these constant waterfalls bite into the rock, washing away the softer limestone and carving out those deep, vertical, U-shaped channels before pooling on the floor of the trench around the statue's paws. Image demonstrating the mechanism of rainwater runoff cascading over a cliff edge and carving vertical channels. This leads us to the absolute core of the mystery, the massive, glaring paradox that fractures the established timeline of human history. According to mainstream Egyptology, the Sphinx was carved out of this rock around 2500 BC. But here's the problem. By 2500 BC, the Sahara Desert was already exactly what it is today: a hyper-arid, bone-dry, sandy wasteland. The climate of Egypt 4,500 years ago was characterized by intense drought, not torrential rain. Sure, they might get a rare flash flood once in a blue moon, but the kind of deep, systemic water erosion seen on the Sphinx enclosure walls requires centuries, if not millennia, of consistent, heavy, pounding rainfall. So, how can a monument that was supposedly constructed in the middle of a completely dry desert display the undeniable physical damage of thousands of years of heavy rain? Some traditional historians, desperately trying to protect the timeline, suggested that maybe the Nile River flooded and washed up against the Sphinx, causing the damage. But from a geological standpoint, this argument falls apart immediately. A rising river flood creates undercutting. It washes away the bottom of a structure horizontally, like waves hitting a beach. It does not cascade from the top down. The damage on the Sphinx enclosure clearly, irrefutably, comes from water pouring down from above. Other experts argued that maybe the wind in this specific spot just acts weirdly, mimicking water damage. But this too makes no sense when you look at the surrounding area. There are Old Kingdom tombs located just a few hundred yards away from the Sphinx, carved out of the exact same type of limestone, definitively dated to around 2500 BC. These tombs show classic wind and sand weathering, the rounded, horizontal layers we talked about earlier. They do not have the deep, vertical water scars. If the Sphinx and these nearby tombs were built at the exact same time, from the exact same rock, in the exact same environment, they should have weathered in the exact same way. But they didn't. The Sphinx enclosure looks entirely different because it experienced an entirely different weather system. The stone is screaming a truth that the history books refuse to hear. The Great Sphinx sat outside under heavy rains for thousands of years before the Sahara ever became a desert. And to find a time when Egypt experienced that kind of rainfall, we have to look past the pharaohs, past the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, and travel deep into prehistoric times. We have to rewind the climate clock to an era that scientists call the Green Sahara, to understand how the Sahara Desert could have possibly possessed the climate necessary to literally carve deep, cascading waterfalls into solid limestone. We have to completely abandon the world as we know it today. We have to jump into a geological time machine and travel back long before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown, long before the invention of the wheel, and long before written language existed. We need to rewind the clock to roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. At this point in prehistoric time, the Earth was in the final, freezing grip of the Pleistocene epoch, more commonly known to all of us as the last ice age. When you hear Ice Age, you probably picture the entire globe turned into a giant snowball, covered in freezing blizzards and roaming woolly mammoths. But the reality of global climate is much more complex. While massive, miles-thick sheets of ice completely crushed the northern parts of North America, Europe, and Asia, the weather closer to the equator was drastically different. Because so much of the Earth's water was frozen solid and locked up in those giant northern glaciers, the global water cycle was incredibly slow. Less liquid water in the oceans meant less evaporation. Less evaporation meant fewer clouds. And fewer clouds meant a severe lack of rain. Because of this, during the peak of the Ice Age, North Africa was actually even drier, windier, and more desolate than the Sahara we know today. It was a massive, hyper-arid dust bowl. But then, everything changed. Around 11,700 years ago, the Earth underwent a massive, rapid, and violent global warming event. The deep freeze finally broke. But why did this happen? It all comes down to the mechanics of how our planet moves through space. The Earth does not just spin perfectly straight up and down on its axis. It actually has a slight tilt. Over cycles of tens of thousands of years, that tilt subtly shifts back and forth, changing the angle at which sunlight hits the planet. Scientists call these orbital shifts Milankovitch cycles. Roughly 11,000 years ago, the Earth's tilt shifted in a way that pointed the northern hemisphere more directly at the sun during the summer months. Suddenly, massive amounts of intense solar radiation were blasting the Earth. The miles-thick ice sheets covering North America and Europe began to rapidly melt. Trillions of gallons of freezing, fresh water violently poured into the oceans, causing global sea levels to rise dramatically, by hundreds of feet. As the oceans absorbed all that intense summer heat from the sun, the water began to evaporate on an unimaginable scale. The global water cycle went from a standstill into absolute overdrive. For North Africa, this orbital shift acted like a giant atmospheric light switch. The intense heat over the massive Eurasian landmass created a low-pressure system that essentially sucked moisture right out of the Atlantic Ocean. Giant, heavy, waterlogged monsoon clouds were dragged forcefully across the African continent. The rain belt, which usually hovered much further south near the equator, suddenly shifted violently to the north. And then it started to rain. And it didn't stop. We are not talking about a rainy season. We are talking about centuries upon centuries of heavy, torrential, ground-soaking monsoons pouring down on what used to be a dry desert. The transformation of the landscape was miraculous. The barren sand dunes drank the water and sprouted life. Over a few millennia, the desert entirely vanished. In its place emerged a vibrant, incredibly lush ecosystem that scientists today refer to as the African humid period, or more popularly, the Green Sahara. Imagine the Sahara Desert, an area roughly the size of the entire United States, not as a sea of dead sand, but as an endless expanse of tall, rolling grasslands, dense tropical savanna, and sprawling forests. Where there are now endless dunes, there were once massive, roaring river systems. There were gigantic, freshwater megalakes. One of these, Lake Megachad, was larger than all of the Great Lakes in North America combined. We know this is not just a wild theory or a guessing game. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study ancient weather, have drilled deep core samples into the sediment of the Atlantic Ocean floor off the coast of Africa. In those layers of deep-sea mud, they found ancient pollen from tropical trees, grasses, and ferns blowing off the continent exactly during this time period. But we also have proof left behind by the people who actually lived there. Today, deep in the absolute, most isolated, bone-dry, and uninhabitable regions of the Sahara Desert, explorers have found ancient caves and rock shelters covered in prehistoric paintings. These cave paintings do not show people dying of thirst in the sand. They show ancient hunters chasing down giraffes, ostriches, and herds of wild cattle. They show people swimming. Most incredibly, they show detailed drawings of crocodiles and hippos. You do not paint a hippopotamus unless you live next to a giant, permanent, deep body of fresh water. Hippos literally cannot survive in a desert. They require massive lakes and rivers to submerge themselves in all day. This Green Sahara period was a paradise for early hunter-gatherer societies, and it lasted for thousands of years. From roughly 10,000 BC down to around 3,000 BC, the skies over Egypt were regularly dark with heavy monsoon rain clouds. Now, picture the Giza Plateau during this vibrant green era. It wasn't a dusty, yellow construction site filled with pharaohs and pyramids. It was a grassy, rain-soaked limestone hill. The heavy rains from those relentless African monsoons would have hammered the bedrock day after day, year after year. The water would have gathered into sheets, rushed across the plateau, and poured violently over any exposed ledges. This is the exact, specific climate required to carve those deep, vertical, cascading U-shaped fissures into solid limestone. It is the only weather system in human history capable of creating the unmistakable water damage we see on the walls surrounding the Great Sphinx. The science of the climate perfectly matches the science of the stone. But if we accept this absolute geological reality, we are forced to confront a mathematical conclusion that completely shatters everything we have been taught in school. We are forced to ask, just how old is the Sphinx? Now that we understand the dramatic climate reality of the Green Sahara, let's do some basic, undeniable chronological math. This is where the mainstream historical narrative completely breaks down, and the true age of the Great Sphinx begins to reveal itself. It is a puzzle of cause and effect, and the pieces simply do not fit into the year 2500 BC. We have established two absolute, scientific facts. Fact number 1. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure feature deep, vertical, scalloped fissures that are the undisputed geological signature of thousands of years of heavy, continuous rainfall. Fact number 2. The era of heavy, continuous rainfall in Egypt, the Green Sahara period, slowly came to an end as the climate shifted back to a hyper-arid desert. So, when exactly did the rain stop? Paleoclimatologists, analyzing those deep-sea mud cores and ancient pollen samples, have pinpointed the end of the African humid period. The Sahara did not dry up overnight, but the massive monsoon rains had largely vanished by around 3000 BC. By the time we reach 2500 BC, the exact time Pharaoh Khafre was supposedly ordering his workers to carve the Sphinx, the Giza Plateau was already a bone-dry, wind-swept desert. It looked almost exactly the way it looks today. Do you see the massive chronological collision here? If Khafre carved the Sphinx out of the solid bedrock in 2500 BC, he was carving it into a dry desert environment. If that were true, the fresh, newly exposed limestone walls of the surrounding pit would only have ever experienced the abrasive, horizontal scraping of wind and sand over the last 4,500 years. They would look smooth, rounded, and horizontally banded, exactly like the nearby tombs built during the same era. But they don't. They are heavily scarred by water. A monument cannot bear the extensive, deep physical trauma of thousands of years of heavy rain if it was built hundreds of years after the heavy rains permanently stopped falling. It is a logical and physical impossibility. It is like finding a snowman standing perfectly intact in the middle of the desert in July and someone trying to convince you it was built yesterday. The environment simply does not support the object. To get the level of deep, cascading water erosion present in the Sphinx enclosure, fissures that are, in some places, up to 6 feet deep. The rock had to be exposed to the elements during the absolute peak of the Green Sahara period. It couldn't have just caught a few final rainstorms at the tail end of the wet era. It had to sit out in the pounding monsoons for millennia. When Dr. Robert Schoch first presented his geological findings, he was very conservative. He suggested that, based purely on the depth of the water erosion, the Sphinx had to be carved at least between 5000 BC and 7000 BC. That alone was a bombshell. It pushed the creation of the monument back thousands of years before the first pharaoh, before the invention of the wheel, and before the recognized dawn of human civilization in Mesopotamia. But as more geologists and independent researchers like John Anthony West looked at the data, the timeline kept getting pushed further back. Why? Because the most violent torrential rainfall, the massive climatic upheaval that featured the most destructive water runoff, didn't happen in 5000 BC. It happened right at the very beginning of the Green Sahara period, during the chaotic, rapid melting of the last ice age. When those massive northern glaciers melted around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Earth's climate was in a state of absolute turmoil. Global sea levels were rising rapidly, and the sudden shift in the monsoon belt would have brought apocalyptic levels of rainfall to North Africa. If we match the sheer severity of the water damage on the Sphinx enclosure to the most severe period of rainfall in Egypt's ancient climate history, the mathematical pointer lands squarely in the ballpark of 10,000 BC. This is not just a minor historical correction. This is not moving a date back by a few centuries. Pushing the construction of the Great Sphinx back to 10,000 BC is a paradigm shift of epic proportions. It completely rewrites the story of human evolution. Think about what we are taught in school about the year 10,000 BC. According to standard textbooks, humans at that time were primitive hunter-gatherers. We were supposedly wearing animal skins, living in caves, and just barely figuring out how to domesticate wild wheat and herd sheep. We were roaming in small nomadic tribes, struggling simply to survive the harsh elements of a post-Ice Age world. But if the Sphinx was built in 10,000 BC, that entire narrative is wrong. Carving the Great Sphinx was not a primitive undertaking. It required a profound understanding of three-dimensional geometry, architectural scale, and proportion. It required hundreds, if not thousands, of organized, highly skilled laborers. It required complex logistics to feed and house those workers. Most importantly, removing thousands of tons of solid limestone bedrock to free the colossal statue required advanced quarrying techniques and an incredibly structured society. Primitive hunter-gatherers scrambling for their next meal do not wake up one day and decide to meticulously carve a 240-foot-long, perfectly proportioned stone lion out of the living bedrock. The water erosion on the Sphinx is the ultimate smoking gun of ancient history. It points to a terrifying and awe-inspiring conclusion. A highly advanced, organized, and scientifically capable civilization existed on the Giza Plateau over 12,000 years ago. They built magnificent monuments, and then something happened. They vanished, swallowed by the sands of time, leaving only their giant stone guardian behind to weather the millennia of rain. And this brings us to one of the most glaring visual anomalies of the Sphinx itself. If this ancient, lost civilization built this monument in 10,000 BC, there is one massive detail that makes absolutely no sense. If they were master architects capable of such perfect scale and geometry, why did they carve a head that is ridiculously, laughably too small for its giant body? When you look at a photograph of the Great Sphinx, or even if you are lucky enough to stand right in front of it on the Giza Plateau, your eyes are immediately drawn to one specific place. Human psychology dictates that we naturally look for a face. We lock onto those giant stone eyes staring endlessly towards the eastern horizon. We look at the missing nose, the subtle curve of the lips, and the remnants of the royal headdress. Because we are so completely mesmerized by the human face on this ancient monument, we suffer from a massive collective blind spot. We completely miss the forest for the trees. But if you take a few dozen steps back, walk around to the side of the excavated pit, and look at the monument in its entirety from a profile view, a glaring, undeniable physical anomaly jumps out at you. The proportions are completely, almost comically, wrong. The head of the Great Sphinx is entirely too small for its massive, sprawling body. To understand just how bizarre this is, we have to look at the people who supposedly built it. The ancient Egyptians were many things, but above all, they were absolute masters of geometry, mathematics, and artistic proportion. They did not just wing it when they built a temple or carved a statue. They operated on a strictly standardized system of measurement. If you look at ancient Egyptian artwork, whether it is a painting on a tomb wall or a towering statue at the Temple of Luxor, you will find an obsessive dedication to perfect ratios. The ancient artisans used a very specific grid system. A human figure, for example, was always drawn using a grid of exactly 18 squares from the soles of the feet to the hairline. It did not matter if they were carving a tiny wooden doll that could fit in your pocket or a 60-foot-tall stone giant. The mathematical ratios of the arms, the torso, the legs, and the head were always identical, flawless and perfectly scaled. They believed that achieving this mathematical perfection in their art and architecture was a way to maintain cosmic order and harmony in the universe. Now take that obsessive dedication to perfect, harmonious math and apply it to the Great Sphinx. It is a disaster. The body of the Sphinx is a sprawling, muscular behemoth. It stretches roughly 240 feet long. The back is incredibly wide, the chest is broad, and the paws resting in front are gigantic. If you look at the anatomy of a real lion, the head is massive. A lion's head has to be huge and heavily muscled to support the crushing jaw strength required to take down prey on the African savanna. A natural lion's head is completely proportionate to its powerful shoulders, but the head currently sitting on the Great Sphinx looks like a tiny pinhead resting on top of a mountain. Let's use an everyday example to make this visually clear. Imagine going to a bodybuilding competition. You see a massive 250-pound professional athlete with incredibly broad shoulders, huge arms, and a massive chest. But sitting on top of this giant, muscular torso is the head of a 5-year-old child. That is exactly how the Sphinx looks when viewed objectively from the side. The head is entirely dwarfed by the sheer volume of the back and haunches. So, we are faced with a massive logical paradox. Mainstream history asks us to believe that Pharaoh Khafre's master architects, the same brilliant minds capable of aligning millions of tons of stone to true north to build the Great Pyramid, the same geniuses who used sacred geometry in every single thing they created, somehow just messed up the math on the most important, largest sculpture of their entire civilization. Are we supposed to believe they carved this 240-foot massive lion body, stepped back, looked at the tiny little head they put on it, shrugged their shoulders, and said, "Hey, close enough?" That makes absolutely no logical or historical sense. A highly advanced, organized workforce capable of removing thousands of tons of bedrock does not suddenly forget how to use a ruler. But the mystery deepens when we bring our geologist glasses back out and look at the actual stone itself. The head of the Sphinx is telling a completely different geological story than the body. We have already established that the sprawling body of the monument, along with the massive limestone walls surrounding it in the pit, are heavily scarred by deep, vertical water fissures. They bear the undeniable signature of thousands of years of heavy, pounding rain from the Green Sahara period, dating back to around 10,000 BC. But when you look closely at the head of the Sphinx, those deep, vertical water channels are completely missing. Now, mainstream geologists will quickly point out that the head is carved from a slightly different, harder geological layer of rock known as the Member 3 strata, which naturally resists erosion better than the softer rock of the body. And that is scientifically true. However, even accounting for the harder rock, the type of weathering is completely different. The face and head show the classic, rounded, horizontal scraping of wind and sand erosion. The head looks like it has been sitting in a dry desert environment for about 4,500 years. The body looks like it sat in torrential, jungle-like rainfall for millennia. Why does the colossal body look 12,000 years old and horribly water-damaged, while the tiny, disproportionate head looks only 4,500 years old and wind-damaged. When you combine the glaring mathematical failure of the proportions with the completely mismatched geological weathering, there is only one rational physical conclusion to draw. You are looking at a monument that has been fundamentally altered. The head we see today on the Great Sphinx is not the original head. The master builders of 10,000 BC did not make a mathematical error. They carved a perfectly proportioned, massive monument. But thousands of years later, someone else came along and completely changed it. The face of the Sphinx is not a glorious original creation. It is the scene of an ancient, monumental crime. If the head of the Great Sphinx is completely out of proportion to its massive body, and if it shows an entirely different geological weathering pattern than the trench it sits in, we are left with a fascinating forensic puzzle. We have to look at this giant stone monument as an active crime scene of historical vandalism. To understand what happened, you have to understand the fundamental rule of stone masonry. Working with solid rock is a one-way street. Unlike working with wet clay or modern concrete, you cannot magically add material back once it is gone. You can only subtract. You can only chisel away. Therefore, if the current human head is far too small for the lion's body, simple logic dictates that the original head sitting on those massive shoulders had to be significantly larger. It had to be massive enough that thousands of years later, someone could come along, chisel off the heavily eroded outer layers, and carve an entirely new, smaller face out of the remaining core of the rock. So, what was the original face of the Sphinx before it was stolen? Independent researchers and alternative historians generally point to two major possibilities, both of which make much more anatomical and historical sense than what we see today. The first and most obvious hypothesis is that the Sphinx was originally carved as a complete, perfectly proportioned lion. If you trace the timeline back to 10,500 BC, during the peak of the Green Sahara period, the people living in that lush, vibrant landscape would have been intimately familiar with lions. Lions are symbols of immense raw power, majesty, and dominance. If an advanced civilization wanted to carve a guardian to watch over their sacred plateau, a giant lion makes perfect sense. Fast forward 8,000 years. The massive lion head has been battered by centuries of torrential rain. Its facial features have melted away into deep, vertical scars. It looks like a giant, ruined lump of rock sticking out of the sand. But there is a second, highly compelling theory pushed by historical researcher Robert Temple. He argues that the original statue was not a lion at all, but a massive carving of a jackal, specifically the Egyptian god Anubis. Why a jackal? Let's look at the anatomy again. If you observe a lion resting in the wild, its beak is not perfectly flat. A lion has a distinct, curved spine, heavily pronounced shoulder blades, and a massive, sloping mane. But the back of the Great Sphinx is entirely flat, straight as a board from the neck down to the hips. Now, look at how a wild dog or a jackal rests. They lay with their backs perfectly flat, their hind legs tucked tightly beneath them, and their front paws stretched straight out in front of their bodies. The posture of the Sphinx perfectly mimics the natural resting position of a canine, not a feline. Furthermore, let's look at the cultural context. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Anubis, the god with the head of a jackal or wild dog, was the ultimate guardian of the dead. His specific job was to watch over the necropolis, the city of tombs. The Giza Plateau is exactly that, a massive, sprawling ancient graveyard. Having a colossal statue of Anubis guarding a burial site aligns perfectly with ancient traditions. Whether it was originally a magnificent lion or the vigilant jackal god Anubis, the timeline inevitably brings us back to roughly 2500 BC, to the era of Pharaoh Khafre. Imagine Khafre arriving at the Giza Plateau to build his massive pyramid. He surveys his domain and sees this colossal ancient beast sitting in the sand. It is heavily water-damaged, its original features barely recognizable after weathering thousands of years of extreme climate change. It is a relic from a forgotten age. Pharaohs were not exactly known for their humility. They were living gods on earth. It was an incredibly common practice in ancient Egypt for a new pharaoh to find statues or monuments built by their predecessors, chisel off the old names, and carve their own names into the stone to claim the glory. This process of architectural hijacking happened all the time. Khafre, or perhaps one of his immediate predecessors, looked at this heavily damaged ancient beast and saw an opportunity for the ultimate ego boost. He ordered his master sculptors to build scaffolding around the massive, ruined head of the animal. They chiseled away the deeply water-eroded stone, the snout, the ears, the mane, until they reached the fresh, unweathered rock underneath. Out of that smaller block of fresh stone, they painstakingly carved the face of a human pharaoh wearing the royal Nemes headdress. This single, logical act of ancient vandalism explains every single anomaly we see today. It explains why the head is ridiculously small for the body, because it was carved out of the stump of a much larger, older head. It explains why the head does not have the deep, vertical water erosion of the body, because the water-damaged layers of the original head were physically chipped away and thrown into the sand in 2500 BC, exposing fresh rock that has only experienced wind and sand erosion for the last 4,500 years. And it explains why mainstream historians are so desperately confused. They are looking at a head from 2500 BC attached to a body from 10,000 BC. And they are trying to force both pieces to fit into the exact same chapter of a history book. But if this is true, if Khafre simply usurped an ancient monument that was already sitting there, wouldn't the ancient Egyptians themselves have written that down? Wouldn't there be some kind of record, some ancient text, proving that the Sphinx existed long before Khafre ever claimed it? As a matter of fact, there is. And it is a piece of evidence that the mainstream historical establishment has spent over a century trying to bury. Up to this point, our investigation into the true age of the Great Sphinx has relied almost entirely on physical evidence. We have looked at the deep, cascading water erosion on the enclosure walls, mapped the ancient climate shifts of the Green Sahara, and examined the glaring mathematical and anatomical errors of the statue's tiny head. To a geologist, a climatologist, or a forensic engineer, this physical evidence is more than enough to prove the monument is vastly older than 4,500 years. But traditional historians and Egyptologists operate under a different set of rules. They are not trained to read rocks. They are trained to read texts. For over a century, the academic establishment has demanded written proof. Their defense is simple. If the Sphinx was actually sitting there thousands of years before Pharaoh Khafre supposedly carved it, why didn't the ancient Egyptians themselves write that down? If it is a relic of a forgotten, older civilization, surely someone in the ancient world would have mentioned it. The shocking truth is that they did. There is an ancient, carved text that explicitly states the Sphinx was already sitting on the Giza plateau, heavily damaged, before Khafre ever sat on the throne. But instead of rewriting the history books when this text was found, the mainstream academic establishment actively chose to label it as a piece of ancient fake news. Let's travel back to the year 1858. A French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette, one of the founding fathers of modern Egyptology, was conducting a massive excavation on the Giza Plateau. He was digging just east of the Great Pyramid, clearing away centuries of accumulated sand and debris. During this dig, he uncovered the ruins of a small, ruined building known as the Temple of Isis, and right inside this temple, buried in the rubble, his team discovered a fascinating piece of limestone. This artifact became known to the world as the inventory stela. A stela, as we learned earlier with the dream stele, is essentially a giant stone tablet used for public records, decrees, or religious texts. The inventory stela is exactly what its name suggests. It is an inventory, a detailed, itemized list of statues, monuments, and properties associated with the Temple of Isis. But what makes this specific piece of limestone so dangerously controversial is the story it tells in its introduction. The text is written from the perspective of Pharaoh Khufu. To understand the absolute gravity of this, we need a quick refresher on the Egyptian royal family tree. Khufu is the legendary pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. More importantly for our mystery, Khufu is the father of Pharaoh Khafre, the man who textbooks claim carved the Sphinx. According to the translation of the hieroglyphs on the inventory stela, Pharaoh Khufu states that he was walking the grounds of the Giza Plateau, surveying the landscape. The text clearly records that Khufu found the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, beside the house of the Sphinx. Read that again. The father of Khafre states, on a carved stone tablet, that he found a temple sitting right next to the Sphinx. The text goes on to describe the Sphinx in vivid detail, referring to it as a great divine statue. But it doesn't just say the Sphinx was there, it says the Sphinx was damaged. The stela records that Khufu noticed the monument had suffered from extreme wear and tear, specifically mentioning a lightning strike that had damaged part of the statue's headdress. Seeing this magnificent, ancient guardian in a state of disrepair, Khufu gave a royal order to have it painstakingly repaired and restored. The logical implications of this text are absolutely devastating to the mainstream historical timeline. It is a matter of basic, undeniable chronology. If Pharaoh Khufu, the father, saw the Sphinx sitting in the sand, noted that it was heavily damaged by the elements, and ordered his workers to repair it, then it is physically, temporally impossible for his son, Khafre, to have created it from scratch decades later. If your father buys an old, broken-down house and pays to have the roof fixed, you cannot claim you built the house from the ground up 20 years later. The inventory stela is the smoking gun of the Giza Plateau. It perfectly aligns with the geological evidence of water erosion. It completely supports the theory that the Sphinx is a massively ancient monument, thousands of years older than the Egyptian civilization, and that the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, like Khufu and later Khafre, merely dug it out of the sand, repaired it, and claimed it as their own. So, with this incredible piece of written evidence sitting in the Cairo Museum, Why are textbooks still teaching that Khafre built it? How does the academic establishment simply ignore an ancient Egyptian text that destroys their entire theory? They do it by attacking the messenger. When mainstream Egyptologists realized the danger the inventory stela posed to their timeline, they subjected the text to intense linguistic analysis. They looked at the specific style of the hieroglyphs, the grammar used, and the spelling of certain words. What they found was that the language on the stela did not match the way ancient Egyptians wrote during the Old Kingdom, around 2500 BC, when Khufu lived. Instead, the grammatical style perfectly matched a much later era of Egyptian history known as the 26th dynasty, or the Site period, which occurred roughly around 600 BC. Because the grammar and spelling on the stone are from 600 BC, mainstream historians confidently declared the entire artifact to be a forgery. They labeled it a piece of historical fiction, a fake document created by priests of the Temple of Isis thousands of years after Khufu died, simply to make their temple seem more important by associating it with a famous ancient king. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. Because the physical stone was carved later, they assumed the story it told was completely made up. Case closed. The Khafre timeline was safe again. But this mainstream dismissal ignores a massive, fundamental reality of how information was preserved in the ancient world. Imagine you have a highly treasured, sacred, handwritten recipe from your great-great-grandmother, written in the year 1850. The paper is old, yellowed, brittle, and crumbling to dust. To save the information before the original paper completely disintegrates, you sit down at your computer in the year 2024, type out the recipe, and print it on a fresh piece of modern printer paper. If an archaeologist digs up your printed paper 1,000 years from now, they will analyze the ink and the paper and correctly determine it was created in 2024. They might even notice you used some updated modern spelling. But does that mean the recipe itself was invented in 2024? No. The physical medium is new, but the information it carries is authentic and much, much older. This exact process of copying, updating, and preserving decaying ancient texts was a sacred, institutionalized practice in ancient Egypt. We know for an absolute fact that Egyptian scribes meticulously copied older papyrus scrolls and crumbling stone inscriptions onto new monuments to save the knowledge. The most famous example of this is the Shabaka stone. Pharaoh Shabaka, who ruled long after the Old Kingdom, explicitly ordered his scribes to find a worm-eaten, decaying ancient text, translate it into the modern grammar of their day, and carve it into a giant block of black basalt, so the knowledge would not be lost forever. Alternative historians and independent researchers argue that the inventory stela is the exact same thing. Yes, the physical limestone block discovered by Auguste Mariette was likely carved by priests during the 26th dynasty in 600 BC. They used the spelling and grammar of their time. But they were not writing a fiction novel. They were faithfully copying a much older, crumbling Old Kingdom record that detailed the actual actions of Pharaoh Khufu. Furthermore, let's look at the psychology of the text. If priests in 600 BC wanted to make up a fake story to glorify Pharaoh Khufu, why would they invent a story where he simply repairs a damaged statue? In ancient Egyptian propaganda, kings are always the grand creators, the conquerors, the builders of worlds. If you are writing a fake text to make a king look like a god, you say he built the Sphinx. You don't say he found it broken and patched it up. The mundane, specific detail of repairing a lightning strike on the statue's head sounds exactly like a literal, historical inventory log, not a piece of glorified mythology. The inventory. Stela is a terrifying piece of evidence for the established academic order. It is an ancient voice echoing from the past, corroborating the deep water erosion carved into the bedrock. It tells us that the Sphinx is an orphan of time, a monument so unimaginably ancient that even the builders of the Great Pyramids looked upon it with awe, wondering who left it there. But if this monument was truly standing on the Giza Plateau in 10,000 BC, watching the relentless rains of the Green Sahara, what exactly was it looking at? To answer that, we have to pull our eyes away from the earth and look up into the ancient night sky. To truly crack the mystery of the Great Sphinx and understand its ultimate purpose, we have to look away from the scarred bedrock of the Giza Plateau. We have to leave behind the deep water fissures, the crumbling limestone, and the ancient Egyptian text of the inventory stela. We must lift our eyes from the dirt and look up into the immense, silent expanse of the night sky. Welcome to the mind-bending world of archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy is exactly what it sounds like. It is the marriage of archaeology and astronomy. It is the scientific study of how ancient civilizations understood the phenomena in the sky, how they used the stars to track time, and most importantly, how they built their most sacred colossal monuments to perfectly align with specific celestial bodies. To modern people living in brightly lit cities, the night sky is mostly just a dark ceiling. We have smartphones, digital calendars, and GPS to tell us exactly where we are and what time it is. But for the ancient builders of the world, whether they were in Egypt, Central America, or prehistoric Europe, the sky was everything. It was their compass, their clock, their calendar, and their religion all rolled into one massive, glowing canopy. They observed the heavens with an obsessive, terrifying precision. They recognized that the stars were not just scattered randomly, but moved in highly predictable, mathematical cycles. And they believed that to bring harmony to their civilizations on Earth, their architecture had to physically mirror the perfect order of the cosmos above. As above, so below was not just a philosophical saying. It was a strict architectural blueprint. But there is a massive catch when we try to look at the sky through the eyes of the ancients. The night sky is not a static painting. It is a giant, moving mechanism. The stars you see when you walk outside tonight are not in the exact same positions as the stars Pharaoh Khafre saw when he walked the Giza Plateau, and they are vastly different from the stars that shone down during the torrential rains of the Green Sahara. If we want to understand what the Sphinx is doing, we have to rewind the cosmic clock. And to do that, we have to understand a fundamental, incredibly slow, and deeply fascinating astronomical mechanism known as the precession of the equinoxes. Precession sounds like a heavy, intimidating scientific term, but it is actually a very simple mechanical concept that you have likely seen 100 times in your own living room. Imagine a child's toy spinning top. When you pull the string and send the top spinning violently across the floor, it stands perfectly straight up, spinning rapidly on its vertical axis. But as the top begins to lose momentum, something happens. The top continues to spin fast, but the very tip of its axis starts to lean slightly to the side and slowly traces a wide, lazy circle in the air. The top is wobbling. Our planet, the Earth, is simply a giant, heavy spinning top floating in the vacuum of space. The Earth actually has three distinct motions. First, it spins around on its own axis once every 24 hours, which gives us day and night. Second, it travels in a massive orbital circle around the Sun once every 365 days, which gives us our changing seasons. But there is a third motion. Because the Earth is not a perfect, solid sphere, it actually bulges out slightly around the equator. And because the gravity of the Sun and the Moon are constantly pulling on that bulge, the Earth wobbles. Just like the slowing toy top, the North Pole of the Earth does not point at the exact same spot in deep space forever. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, traces a massive, invisible circle against the backdrop of the stars. This celestial wobble is incredibly slow. It takes the Earth roughly 72 years to shift just 1 single degree on this circular path. That means for a human being to live a long life and look up at the sky, the stars appear completely permanent and unmoving. But over centuries and millennia, the shift becomes massive. It takes the Earth approximately 26,000 years to complete one full 360-degree wobble. Ancient astronomers, who kept meticulous records over generations, called this massive 26,000-year cycle the Great Year. So, what does this giant cosmic wobble actually do to our view from the ground? It changes our background scenery. Let's use the North Star as a prime example. Today, if you look due north into the night sky, the Earth's axis points almost directly at a bright star we call Polaris. It is our reliable North Star. But if you take a time machine back to 2500 BC, the time mainstream history says the pyramids and the Sphinx were built, the Earth was tilted at a different angle on its 26,000-year wobble. Back then, the axis did not point at Polaris. It pointed at a completely different star named Thuban, located in the constellation of Draco. But the most important visual change caused by precession, and the one that holds the ultimate key to the Great Sphinx, happens on the eastern horizon. Ancient cultures paid obsessive attention to 4 specific days of the year: the summer solstice, the longest day, the winter solstice, the shortest day, and the 2 equinoxes. The vernal, or spring equinox, is the exact day in March when the sun crosses the celestial equator, making day and night perfectly equal in length all over the world. To the ancients, this day represented rebirth, balance, and the start of a new astronomical year. Now, imagine standing in Egypt on the morning of the spring equinox, looking due east, waiting for the sun to rise. Just before the sun breaks over the horizon, the sky begins to lighten, but you can still clearly see the stars sitting directly behind where the sun is about to emerge. Those background stars form a constellation, one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Because of the Earth's slow precessional wobble, that background constellation does not stay the same forever. Like a giant cosmic roulette wheel, clicking very slowly in reverse, the constellation that houses the rising sun on the spring equinox changes roughly every 2,160 years. Currently, on the spring equinox, the sun rises against the backdrop of the constellation Pisces, the fishes, and we are slowly transitioning into the age of Aquarius. This is where the famous pop culture concept of the Age of Aquarius comes from. It is literal astronomy. If we go back roughly 2,000 years to the time of the Roman Empire, the sun was rising in Aries, the ram. If we keep rewinding the precessional clock back to 2500 BC, the era when Pharaoh Khafre supposedly ordered the construction of the Great Sphinx, the sun on the morning of the spring equinox was rising directly into the constellation of Taurus, the bull. This slow, predictable shifting of the heavens is the ultimate, unbreakable cosmic clock. And the Great Sphinx of Giza was purposely built to be the hands of that clock. The Sphinx is not just placed randomly in the desert. It is flawlessly, mathematically aligned to face true geographical east. It stares eternally, unblinkingly, at the exact spot on the horizon where the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox. The question is not just who built the Sphinx, but when did they build it? If we want to know the true birthday of this colossal stone guardian, we simply have to ask the archaeoastronomical clock. We have to rewind the heavens and find out exactly what constellation the Sphinx was staring at when the heavy rains of the green Sahara were carving deep, vertical scars into its massive limestone body. And when we do that, the stars align to tell a story that will give you chills. We have established that the Great Sphinx is essentially the unmoving stone hand of a massive astronomical clock. It sits perfectly aligned on the Giza Plateau, staring fixedly at true east. Because of the Earth's slow, 26,000-year precessional wobble, the constellation that rises directly in front of the Sphinx on the morning of the spring equinox changes over the millennia. Now, let's apply the ultimate test of ancient Egyptian logic to the mainstream historical timeline. The fundamental rule of ancient sacred architecture, deeply rooted in their esoteric science and religion, was a concept known as above, so below. This meant that the monuments built on the earth had to act as a perfect physical mirror to the divine order of the stars in the sky. It was not just for aesthetics. It was a magical and mathematical requirement to bind the heavens to the earth. So, if we accept the textbook theory that Pharaoh Khafre built the Sphinx in 2500 BC, what was his colossal stone lion staring at? If we use modern astronomical software to rewind the night sky back to the spring equinox in the year 2500 BC, the sun rises directly against the backdrop of the constellation Taurus, the bull. From a symbolic and architectural standpoint, this is a massive, glaring contradiction. Why would the greatest master builders of the ancient world, a culture absolutely obsessed with perfect symbolic harmony, carve a 240-foot-long, magnificent lion to stare endlessly at a bull? It breaks their own cardinal rule. There is no as above, so below, when the earth is a feline and the sky is a bovine. It is an astronomical mismatch. But what happens if we refuse to accept the 2500 BC narrative? What if we listen to the geological evidence, the deep, cascading water fissures carved by the heavy rains of the green Sahara? What if we grab the dial of that cosmic clock and violently spin it backward, past the age of Taurus, past the age of Gemini, past the age of Cancer, and land squarely in the chaotic, wet, post-Ice Age world of 10,500 BC? When we do this, the mathematical mismatch vanishes, and we are left with a spectacle of sheer, awe-inspiring perfection. Picture the Giza Plateau roughly 12,500 years ago. The landscape is not a desolate desert, but a lush, vibrant green savanna, soaked by the relentless monsoons. It is the morning of the vernal equinox, the most sacred day of the ancient calendar, symbolizing the rebirth of the world. As you stand behind the Great Sphinx, looking over its massive shoulders towards the eastern horizon, the dark, pre-dawn sky begins to glow with the first light of morning. And there, rising majestically out of the earth just moments before the sun breaks the horizon, is the massive constellation of Leo, the celestial lion. In the year 10,500 BC, on the exact day that marks the beginning of the astronomical year, the giant stone lion on the ground is looking directly, eye to eye, at his starry counterpart in the heavens. As above, so perfectly below. The earthly monument is a flawless, undeniable mirror of the cosmos. This astronomical alignment was famously championed by researchers like Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, who recognized that the Sphinx is not an isolated monument. It is just one piece of a much larger, incredibly sophisticated master map left on the Giza Plateau. To fully grasp the genius of this prehistoric layout, we have to look briefly at the three great pyramids sitting right behind the Sphinx. For centuries, people wondered why the three pyramids were not built in a perfectly straight line. The two largest pyramids align beautifully, but the third, smaller pyramid is offset to the left. Mainstream historians brushed this off as a mistake or a geographical necessity. But Bauval, looking at the sky, realized the layout of the three pyramids is an exact two-scale terrestrial map of the three stars that make up the belt of the constellation Orion. The offset of the third pyramid perfectly matches the natural offset of the third star in Orion's belt. And here is where the math becomes completely undeniable. Because of the Earth's precessional wobble, the constellation of Orion slowly moves up and down in the night sky over that 26,000-year cycle. If you track Orion's movement, it reaches its absolute lowest point in the sky, its anchor point, in the exact same era, 10,500 BC. In that specific ancient epoch, the entire Giza Plateau turns into a unified, functioning cosmic machine. The Milky Way galaxy in the sky perfectly mirrors the winding path of the Nile River on the ground. The three stars of Orion's belt at their lowest precessional point perfectly match the three massive pyramids. And the Great Sphinx, the colossal stone lion, sits exactly where it should, gazing directly into the heart of the constellation Leo on the spring equinox. What are the mathematical odds of this being a coincidence? What are the chances that the deep, vertical water erosion on the Sphinx points to a time of heavy rainfall at the end of the Ice Age, and the astronomical alignment of the stars points to that exact same specific millennium? You do not get two entirely different branches of science, geology and archaeoastronomy, pointing to the exact same 12,000-year-old window by sheer accident. The Great Sphinx is not a tomb. It is not a monument to the ego of a pharaoh named Khafre. It is an architectural timestamp. It is a message carved in thousands of tons of living bedrock, left by a civilization that possessed a profound, highly advanced understanding of orbital mechanics, climatology, and geometry. They built this cosmic clock to tell whoever found it in the distant future exactly when it was created. But this overwhelming evidence forces us to confront an incredibly uncomfortable question. a question that terrifies mainstream historians. If a highly advanced, organized civilization was mapping the stars and carving colossal, mathematically perfect monuments out of bedrock in 10,500 BC, where is everyone else? According to standard history, humanity at the end of the Ice Age consisted of primitive hunter-gatherers living in caves, chasing mammoths with sharp sticks. How could a civilization of master astronomers and engineers exist in a world of cavemen? For decades, critics used this exact argument to dismiss the true age of the Sphinx. They demanded proof. They said, "If a civilization this advanced existed 12,000 years ago, show us another one. Show us any other site on Earth from that time period that proves humans were capable of moving massive stones." And for a long time, alternative historians didn't have a good answer. The Sphinx stood alone as an unexplained anomaly, until a shepherd in southeastern Turkey noticed a strange, oddly shaped rock sticking out of the dirt on a dusty hilltop. What archaeologists unearthed beneath that hill would completely shatter the timeline of human evolution, vindicate the true age of the Sphinx, and prove that everything we thought we knew about our primitive ancestors was wrong. For decades, the biggest weapon that mainstream historians wielded against the true age of the Great Sphinx was a simple demand for context. They stood behind their podiums and essentially said, "Okay, let's pretend for a moment that your geological water erosion and your astronomical alignments are correct. Let's pretend a highly advanced civilization carved a 240-foot limestone lion on the Giza Plateau in 10,500 BC. If that is true, they couldn't have existed in a vacuum. Where is the rest of their world? Show us one single other megalithic site on planet Earth from that exact same time period. Because according to all accepted archaeological evidence, humanity in 10,000 BC was nothing more than small, disorganized bands of primitive hunter-gatherers. It was a devastatingly effective argument. Without another site to corroborate the timeline, the Sphinx was treated as an isolated, unexplainable freak of nature, and the mainstream textbook timeline remained safe until 1994. That year, the protective wall of the mainstream historical narrative didn't just crack, it completely collapsed, shattered by a discovery on a dusty ridge in southeastern Turkey. Local shepherds had known for years that the hill, known as Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill, was full of strange, rectangular rocks sticking out of the earth. They routinely cleared them away because they interfered with their grazing sheep. But when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site, he realized instantly that these were not natural rocks. They were the exposed tops of massive, deliberately carved ancient megaliths. When Schmidt and his team began to dig, what they unearthed sent an absolute shockwave through the global scientific community. They did not find the remnants of a primitive hunter-gatherer camp. They did not find a few scattered fire pits and sharpened sticks. They found a sprawling, highly complex, astronomically aligned megalithic temple complex. To understand why this site is so revolutionary, we have to look at the scale and the art of what was buried under that hill. The builders of Göbekli Tepe quarried, transported, and erected massive T-shaped limestone pillars. These pillars were arranged in large, perfect stone circles. Some of the central pillars stand up to 20 feet tall and weigh an astonishing 10 to 20 tons each. Moving a 20-ton block of solid stone, is a monumental feat of engineering today, requiring heavy diesel cranes and flatbed trucks. Yet, somehow, ancient people managed to cut these pillars out of a nearby limestone quarry, drag them hundreds of yards up a hill, and stand them perfectly upright in highly organized geometric rings. But the engineering is only half the story. It is the artwork on these pillars that truly changes our perspective on prehistoric humanity. These massive stones are not blank. They are covered in breathtaking, incredibly detailed carvings of animals. And we are not talking about simple stick figures scratched onto the surface like a child's drawing. These are high-relief, three-dimensional sculptures. There are intricate carvings of scorpions, deadly vipers, leaping foxes, charging wild boars, aggressive lions, and massive vultures holding spherical objects. If you understand stonemasonry, you know that high-relief carving is exceptionally difficult. To make a three-dimensional animal pop out of a flat stone pillar, you do not carve the animal itself. You have to painstakingly chisel away the entire surface of the massive stone around the animal, reducing the background by several inches so the figure is left protruding. This requires immense skill, immense patience, and specialized tools. It is the work of master artisans, not desperate cavemen struggling to survive the winter. But the absolute most mind-bending, paradigm-shifting aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not the art or the weight of the stones. It is the date. Unlike the Great Sphinx, which is carved from exposed bedrock and is notoriously difficult to date definitively, Göbekli Tepe came with an absolute, scientifically indisputable timestamp. At some point in ancient history, for reasons we still completely do not understand, the builders of Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried their own masterpiece. They didn't just abandon it to the wind. They systematically filled these massive stone circles with thousands of tons of dirt, rocks, and animal bones until the entire complex was swallowed by an artificial hill. Because they buried it with dirt containing organic material, like the bones of the animals they ate, modern archaeologists were able to use radiocarbon dating. Carbon dating cannot date stone, but it can absolutely date the organic trash buried right next to the stone. When the radiocarbon test results came back from the laboratories, the archaeologists were stunned. They tested it again and again and again, and the dates were undeniable. The oldest and most sophisticated stone circles at Göbekli Tepe were buried around 8000 BC. But they were constructed, carved, and used starting around 9600 BC. That is roughly 11,600 years ago. Let that number sink in. 11,600 years ago. That is exactly the same prehistoric window that the geological water erosion and the astronomical alignment of Leo point to for the Great Sphinx of Giza. Göbekli Tepe is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It is older than the invention of writing. It is older than the invention of the wheel. It is older than the invention of pottery. Most importantly, it completely destroys the textbook sequence of human evolution. The established narrative taught that humans first invented agriculture, settled down into farming villages, created a stable food supply, and then, thousands of years later, finally had the free time to invent religion and build massive stone temples. Göbekli Tepe flips that entire script upside down. It provides a completely fresh perspective on the dawn of civilization. Here, the temple came first. The sheer amount of labor required to feed the hundreds of workers carving and moving these 20-ton pillars likely forced these ancient people to invent agriculture just to sustain the construction site. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe is the ultimate vindication for the true age of the Great Sphinx. It proves, without a shadow of a scientific doubt, that a highly organized, artistically brilliant, and engineering-capable civilization existed on Earth at the exact same time the Sphinx was being carved in Egypt. The prehistoric void is no longer empty. But if we accept that humanity had reached this incredible peak of megalithic construction 11,600 years ago, what happened to them? Why did they deliberately bury their masterpiece in Turkey? And what catastrophic event forced the builders in Egypt to abandon their giant stone lion to the torrential rains? When you take the geological timeline of the Great Sphinx in Egypt and place it directly next to the radiocarbon-dated timeline of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the illusion of our primitive past shatters completely. We are no longer looking at an isolated anomaly or a random architectural mistake. We are looking at a clear, undeniable pattern. We have two incredibly sophisticated, astronomically aligned megalithic sites, separated by hundreds of miles, both active at the exact same time, roughly 11,600 to 12,000 years ago. Both sites required a massive, highly organized labor force. Both required master stone masons, an advanced understanding of geometry, and a deep knowledge of the changing night sky. And they are not alone. When you start pulling on this thread, you realize that the fingerprint of a lost, advanced global culture is scattered all over the planet. If you travel to West Java, Indonesia, you will find a massive megalithic site called Gunung Padang. For decades, it was believed to be just a natural hill, with some ancient stone terraces on top. But recent ground-penetrating radar and core drilling have revealed that it is actually a massive, multi-layered, artificial pyramid-like structure built over thousands of years. The deepest core samples, pulled from the massive stone chambers hidden far below the surface, have been radiocarbon dated to between 14,000 and 22,000 years old. If you dive off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, you find massive, terraced stone monuments resting quietly under the ocean waves, submerged since the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. This horizontal expansion of evidence forces us to accept a profound and somewhat terrifying reality about human history. Our evolution on this planet has not been a neat, straight line, marching upward from cave-dwelling hunters to modern smartphone users. Instead, the story of humanity is cyclical. It is a story of magnificent peaks and devastating, apocalyptic valleys. We are a species with collective amnesia. The evidence points overwhelmingly to the existence of a highly advanced, potentially global civilization that thrived during the Ice Age. They mapped the stars, navigated the oceans, and built breathtaking stone monuments that were designed to last for eternity. But if this glorious, golden age of humanity truly existed, what happened to them? Where did they go? Why did the builders of Göbekli Tepe desperately bury their magnificent temple under thousands of tons of dirt, as if trying to hide a time capsule from the end of the world? And why was the Great Sphinx left alone, abandoned to endure thousands of years of torrential, pounding rain? The answer lies in the ice, the fire, and the flood. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth experienced an apocalyptic cataclysm that nearly wiped our entire species off the face of the planet. Scientists refer to this specific geological and climatic event as the Younger Dryas. Before the Younger Dryas, the Earth was slowly, peacefully warming up. The glaciers were gradually receding. The people of this advanced Ice Age civilization were thriving. But then, almost overnight in geological terms, the planet was plunged violently back into a deep freeze. This sudden, brutal return to Ice Age conditions lasted for roughly 1,200 years. And then, exactly 11,600 years ago, the exact date of Göbekli Tepe's construction and the Sphinx's alignment, the freeze ended with a massive, unimaginable global heat wave. What caused this violent swing in climate? Growing scientific evidence points to a cosmic impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that the Earth crossed paths with a massive, disintegrating comet. Thousands of fragments of this comet rained down on the planet, heavily bombarding the massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe. The impacts would have been catastrophic. The heat from the cosmic bombardment instantly melted millions of cubic miles of glacial ice. This caused what geologists call a meltwater pulse. Imagine a wall of freezing water hundreds of feet high, roaring across the continents, violently reshaping the landscape and dumping trillions of gallons of fresh water into the oceans in a matter of days. Global sea levels skyrocketed by up to 400 feet. Coastal cities, fertile valleys, and island nations would have been swallowed by the rising oceans almost instantly. The sky would have been choked with ash, smoke, and evaporated water, triggering the endless torrential monsoons of the Green Sahara period that washed over the Giza Plateau and scarred the Great Sphinx. This is not just science. This is human memory. If you travel to any corner of the globe and speak to the indigenous people, you will hear the exact same story. Whether you are reading the biblical story of Noah's Ark, the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu ancient texts, or the oral traditions of the Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest, every single ancient culture on Earth shares a chillingly identical myth: the Great Flood. They all speak of a time when humanity grew proud and advanced, and then the gods grew angry. The sky fell, the earth shook, and a massive, world-destroying deluge of water washed away the old world, leaving only a handful of survivors to start over. Mainstream historians dismiss these flood myths as localized river floods that ancient people exaggerated. But when you align these global myths with the hard geological data of the Younger Dryas comet impact and the sudden, violent rising of the oceans, the mythology suddenly becomes a literal, historical record of a global apocalypse. The advanced civilization of the Ice Age was effectively reset to zero. The brilliant astronomers, master architects, and navigators were wiped out. The few who survived the floods, the earthquakes, and the sudden climate shifts were thrust back into the Stone Age. They were forced to become hunter-gatherers just to survive the harsh new reality of a broken planet. This global paradigm shift perfectly explains the mystery of the Giza Plateau. The Great Sphinx is the ultimate survivor. Carved from the solid, living bedrock of the earth, it was heavy enough to withstand the cataclysms and the torrential rains that followed. It sat there, a silent, deeply scarred guardian, watching the millennia roll by until a new, struggling civilization emerged from the dust thousands of years later. A civilization we now call the ancient Egyptians, When pharaohs like Khufu and Khafre finally discovered the Sphinx, buried up to its neck in the sand, they were not looking at something they built. They were looking at the ruined legacy of their own distant ancestors, the gods of the first time. But if this advanced, lost civilization built the Sphinx as a cosmic clock and a testament to their existence, did they leave anything else behind? Did they hide their knowledge, their tools, or their history from the impending apocalypse? As it turns out, the Sphinx might not just be a statue. It might be a door. And the technology we have today is finally allowing us to look deep beneath the paws of the lion to find out exactly what they buried in the dark. If we accept the overwhelming geological and astronomical evidence that the Great Sphinx is a 12,000-year-old monument built by a highly advanced Ice Age civilization just before a global cataclysm, we are faced with an incredibly profound question. Why did they build it? If you know the world is about to end, if you can read the shifting skies and feel the earth trembling beneath your feet, you do not spend thousands of hours carving a 240-foot stone lion just for decoration. You build it as a marker. You build it as a giant, indestructible X on a map. If an advanced civilization wanted to ensure that their most precious commodity, their knowledge, their history, their science, and their understanding of the cosmos, survived a global flood, they wouldn't leave it in a wooden building or a fragile library. They would bury it deep underground, encased in solid, living bedrock. And they would place a colossal, eternal guardian right on top of it, staring endlessly at the stars, waiting for a future generation advanced enough to understand the message and look beneath its paws. But for thousands of years, looking beneath the Sphinx was physically impossible. You cannot simply take a bulldozer to the most famous archaeological site on the planet. Traditional archaeology is a destructive process. Once you dig a hole, you have permanently altered the site. Because the Giza Plateau is so fiercely protected, the ground beneath the Sphinx remained a total mystery, shielded by millions of tons of solid limestone. That is, until the late 20th century, when a new type of scientist arrived on the plateau carrying equipment that seemed like pure science fiction to the traditional historians. Enter the world of non-invasive geophysical exploration. To understand how we finally peered beneath the Sphinx without lifting a single shovel, we need to understand two incredible pieces of modern technology: ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and seismic tomography. Let's break down how this technology works using an everyday example. Imagine a pregnant woman going to the doctor for a sonogram. The doctor rubs a wand over her stomach, and a machine sends high-frequency sound waves deep into her body. Those invisible sound waves travel through the soft tissue until they hit something denser, like the baby's bones. When they hit that dense object, the sound waves bounce back to the wand, creating an echo. A computer reads how long it took for the echo to return and uses that data to draw a perfect black and white picture of the baby on a screen. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography do the exact same thing, but instead of scanning a human body, they scan the body of the Earth. With GPR, scientists slowly drag a machine across the dirt that shoots electromagnetic radar pulses deep down into the bedrock. If the limestone beneath the surface is totally solid, the radar waves travel at a consistent speed and bounce back evenly. But if those invisible waves suddenly hit an empty space, a cave, a hidden tunnel, or a buried room, The signal drops and bounces back completely differently. Seismic tomography is similar but uses physical vibrations. Scientists place highly sensitive microphones, called geophones, in a line across the ground. Then, they strike a heavy steel plate on the surface with a massive sledgehammer. The shockwave from the hammer blow travels deep down into the earth. By measuring exactly how fast those shockwaves travel between the microphones, a computer can map out the density of the rock below. If the shockwave suddenly slows down, it means it has hit thin air. It means there is a hole in the ground. In the early 1990s, when Dr. Robert Schoch was investigating the water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls, he didn't just rely on his own eyes. He brought a highly respected geophysicist named Thomas Göbekli with him. Göbekli was a master of reading these underground echoes. With permission from the authorities, Göbekli carefully set up his seismic equipment around the Great Sphinx. He ran his lines along the massive flanks of the stone lion and, crucially, right between and beneath its colossal front paws. He swung his sledgehammer, sent the shockwaves deep into the ancient limestone, and waited for the computer to print out the map of the underworld. When the data rolled off the printer, the results were absolutely electrifying. The bedrock beneath the Sphinx was not solid. The seismic waves had hit massive, hollow anomalies. Now, a skeptic might immediately say, "So what? The Giza Plateau is made of limestone. Limestone is notoriously porous. Water naturally carves out sinkholes, underground rivers, and random caves in limestone all the time. And that is an absolute geological fact. Natural voids are incredibly common in Egypt, but nature is incredibly messy. When water naturally eats away at rock, it leaves behind chaotic, jagged, unpredictable shapes. Natural caves look like organic sponges. They slope, they curve, and they branch off randomly. That is not what Thomas Göbekli's seismic data showed. The echoes bouncing back from deep beneath the Sphinx revealed voids that were perfectly, geometrically rectangular. They had sheer, straight walls. They had flat ceilings. Most importantly, they had sharp, precise 90-degree corners. Nature does not do perfect right angles. The ocean does not carve a perfect cube, and underground water does not carve a perfect rectangle. These underground spaces were undeniably artificial. They were man-made chambers, deliberately hollowed out of the solid bedrock, sitting dozens of feet below the surface. One of the largest and most distinct rectangular chambers was found perfectly positioned beneath the right front paw of the Sphinx. The seismic data suggested this specific room measured roughly 25 feet by 40 feet. It was a massive hidden vault. When this data was published, it sent a shockwave not just through the scientific community, but through the world of alternative history and pop culture. Because while the technology to find this room was brand new in the 1990s, the location of the room had actually been predicted with terrifying accuracy 60 years earlier by a man who had never even been to Egypt. To understand the cultural explosion surrounding this discovery, we have to look briefly at a man named Edgar Cayce. During the 1920s and 30s, Edgar Cayce was one of the most famous clairvoyants in the world, often referred to as the sleeping prophet. He would put himself into a deep, self-induced sleep, and from this trance state, he would answer questions on everything from medical diagnoses to ancient history. Cayce spoke endlessly about the lost civilization of Atlantis. He claimed that Atlantis was a highly advanced, global Ice Age culture that was destroyed in a massive, fiery cataclysm. But before the continent sank, Casey claimed that the survivors fled to different parts of the globe, including Egypt. According to his trance readings, these survivors realized that the world was about to enter a dark age. To ensure their scientific and historical knowledge wasn't lost forever, they gathered their records and buried them in a massive underground library. Casey gave this library a legendary name, the Hall of Records. But Casey didn't just say the Hall of Records was somewhere in Egypt. In a reading given in the early 1930s, he gave a highly specific geographic location. He stated that the entrance to the Hall of Records could be found by digging a shaft directly beneath the right front paw of the Great Sphinx. For decades, mainstream academics laughed at Edgar Casey. They dismissed him as a psychic entertainer weaving fairy tales. But then, in 1993, a geophysicist with a sledgehammer and a computer mapped the bedrock beneath the Sphinx. And right where Edgar Casey said the Hall of Records would be, directly beneath the right front paw, the seismic data revealed a perfect 25 by 40 foot artificial, rectangular room. It is one of the most chilling, unexplainable coincidences in modern historical research. A piece of 1930s psychic folklore was suddenly, violently validated by cutting-edge 1990s geophysical science. You would imagine that a discovery of this magnitude would stop the world. You would expect the Egyptian Antiquities Authority to immediately hold a global press conference, bring in the world's best drilling teams, and carefully lower a fiber optic camera into that rectangular void to show humanity what was inside. Was it the Hall of Records? Was it an ancient tomb? Was it a time capsule from the Ice Age? We still don't know, because the moment Dr. Schoch and Thomas Dobecki revealed their findings, the doors to the Sphinx were slammed shut. The reaction from the mainstream Egyptology establishment was swift, aggressive, and highly defensive. The Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt, heavily influenced at the time by the famous and controversial Dr. Zahi Hawass, stepped in and completely halted the research. Dr. Schoch's team was expelled from the Giza Plateau. Independent researchers were suddenly banned from bringing radar or seismic equipment anywhere near the Sphinx. Dr. Hawass went on a massive public relations campaign. He appeared in documentaries and news programs, vehemently denying the existence of any secret chambers. He famously referred to people looking for the Hall of Records as pyramidiates. He insisted that the seismic anomalies were just natural cracks in the rock, completely ignoring the scientific impossibility of perfect 90-degree natural corners. But while the Egyptian government was publicly denying everything, behind the scenes, their actions told a very different, highly suspicious story. Shortly after kicking the independent scientists out, the government initiated a massive, secretive restoration project around the Sphinx. They built high, opaque walls around the enclosure, completely blocking the monument from the view of tourists and outside observers. Heavy machinery was brought in. The official explanation was that rising groundwater from a nearby village was threatening to dissolve the limestone paws of the Sphinx, and they needed to drill deep relief wells to pump the water out. But many whistleblowers, alternative historians, and frustrated geologists suspected a massive cover-up. If you bring giant drilling rigs into an enclosed, secretive site directly over the spot where a massive, rectangular underground chamber was just discovered, are you really just pumping water? Or are you secretly drilling into the vault while the world's cameras are turned away? Rumors have swirled for decades about what might have been quietly pulled out of those chambers in the dead of night. Some claim the chambers were found completely empty, looted thousands of years ago in antiquity. Others believe the Egyptian authorities, terrified that the discovery of a 12,000-year-old advanced civilization would undermine their own national heritage and rewrite the history books, chose to suppress whatever they found. Regardless of whether you believe the government is hiding Ice Age technology or simply protecting their textbook narrative, the hard scientific data remains. The seismic maps do not lie. There are artificial geometric rooms buried beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. The monument is not a solid block of stone. It is a locked door to the underground. But mainstream academia doesn't surrender easily. Faced with water erosion, astronomical alignments, the Göbekli Tepe paradigm shift, and underground radar anomalies, Orthodox historians launched a massive counterattack to defend the timeline of Pharaoh Khafre. To understand this mystery completely, we must look at the science they used to fight back. Up to this point, we have built a massive, compelling case against the established textbook history of the world. We have looked at the profound water erosion on the Giza Plateau, the climate data of the Green Sahara, the astronomical clock pointing to 10,500 BC, the paradigm-shattering megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, and the mysterious rectangular voids hidden deep beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. The evidence seems overwhelmingly in favor of a lost, highly advanced Ice Age civilization. But true science is not a one-sided courtroom. If we want to be intellectually honest investigators, we cannot simply ignore the defense. Mainstream academia, represented by thousands of dedicated Egyptologists, archaeologists, and their own team of brilliant geologists, did not just roll over and accept defeat when Dr. Robert Schoch published his water erosion theory in the 1990s. They fought back fiercely. And they did not just fight back with anger, they fought back with their own incredibly detailed scientific explanations. To truly grasp the depth of this mystery, you have to understand the specific geological and archaeological arguments that mainstream experts use to defend the 2500 BC timeline of Pharaoh Khafre. Their primary line of defense centers around a completely different type of rock destruction. They argue that the deep, vertical fissures on the Sphinx enclosure walls were not caused by thousands of years of torrential rain falling from the sky. Instead, they argue the damage came from the inside out, driven by a quiet, invisible, microscopic process known as haloclasty or salt crystallization weathering. Let's break down exactly how haloclasty works, because it is a fascinating and destructive force of nature. The bedrock of the Giza Plateau is limestone. As we mentioned earlier, limestone is a highly porous sedimentary rock. It acts very much like a giant, dense geological sponge. Now, beneath the dry, blistering sand of the Egyptian desert lies a hidden water table, an underground reservoir of moisture. This groundwater is naturally highly saturated with dissolved mineral salts. Through a process called capillary action, this salty groundwater is slowly, constantly drawn upward through the microscopic pores of the limestone, migrating from deep underground toward the surface of the Sphinx and its surrounding walls. Think of how a dry paper towel absorbs a spill. If you touch the very corner of a paper towel to a puddle of water, the water defies gravity and travels upward, soaking into the dry fibers. The porous limestone of the Sphinx does the exact same thing with the salty groundwater. When this moisture finally reaches the exposed surface of the rock, the intense, baking heat of the Sahara sun causes the water to evaporate into the dry air. But when the water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind. These microscopic salt crystals become lodged deep inside the tiny pores of the limestone, just beneath the surface. This is where the destruction begins. As the temperature drops at night, or when the heavy morning dew rolls in from the nearby Nile River, these embedded salt crystals absorb moisture from the air and physically expand. Furthermore, when the sun rises and superheats the rock, the crystals undergo thermal expansion. When a salt crystal expands inside a microscopic rock pore, it exerts an unimaginable amount of physical pressure against the surrounding stone. It acts like millions of tiny, microscopic bombs detonating simultaneously inside the outer layer of the monument. The pressure forces the outer surface of the limestone to flake, blister, and pop off in large chunks. If you have ever lived in a cold climate where the roads freeze in the winter, you understand this principle perfectly. Water seeps into a tiny crack in the asphalt. The temperature drops, the water turns to ice and expands, and the pressure blows a massive pothole in the street. Haloclasty works on the exact same mechanical principle, just utilizing expanding salt crystals instead of expanding ice. Mainstream geologists such as Dr. James Harrell and Dr. Farouk El-Baz look at the deep, U-shaped fissures on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure and argue that we are simply looking at thousands of years of severe salt flaking, combined with the abrasive desert wind sweeping the fallen debris away. They argue that morning dew on the Giza Plateau causes the salt to expand, the rock crumbles, and the resulting cavities just happen to look like vertical water runoff to the untrained eye. Therefore, according to the mainstream narrative, the Sphinx does not need a prehistoric rainy climate to look heavily water-damaged. It just needs salt and time. But the mainstream defense does not stop at salt. They also point to the fundamental, messy reality of the rock itself. When you look at a photograph of the Great Sphinx, it looks like one solid, uniform piece of stone. But geologically, it is anything but uniform. The bedrock at Giza is essentially a massive, ancient geological layer cake laid down over millions of years at the bottom of a prehistoric ocean. Geologists have divided the rock of the Sphinx into 3 distinct layers, or members. Member 1 is the hard, durable reef limestone that makes up the base and the paws. Member 3 is the relatively hard, dense limestone that forms the tiny, controversial head of the statue. But the massive, sprawling body of the lion and the massive walls of the excavated trench surrounding it are carved out of the middle layer, known as Member 2. Member 2 is an absolute geological nightmare for a stone carver. It is not a solid block. It is comprised of roughly 7 alternating bands of differing rock quality. Imagine stacking a layer of hard, solid brick, followed by a thick layer of soft, crumbly mud, followed by another hard brick, and so on. Mainstream geologists argue that when the monument is exposed to wind, morning dew, and the explosive salt crystallization we just discussed, these alternating layers degrade at radically different speeds. The soft, crumbly mud layers dissolve very quickly, while the harder, brick layers recede much slower. As the soft layers recede inward, the weight of the overhanging hard rock becomes entirely unsupported. Eventually, gravity takes over, and massive, vertical chunks of the hard rock simply break off and crash to the floor of the enclosure. According to orthodox Egyptologists, when a massive vertical chunk of rock breaks off because the soft layer beneath it dissolved, it leaves behind a deep, vertical scar. They argue that Dr. Schoch and alternative historians are confusing the natural, uneven collapsing of these alternating limestone layers with the cascading waterfalls of a prehistoric rainstorm. So, with these robust geological counter-arguments on the table, the mainstream establishment feels entirely justified in keeping the creation of the Sphinx firmly anchored in the year 2500 BC. They have a mechanism, salt and soft rock, that explains the severe damage without requiring a massive climate shift or an unknown Ice Age civilization. But beyond the geology, the academic establishment relies on their strongest weapon, the absolute lack of archaeological context. Archaeology is the science of context. You rarely date a massive stone monument by the stone itself. You date it by the trash left around it. When workers build something massive, they drop tools. They build temporary housing. They break pottery. They leave behind the physical garbage of daily human life. Egyptologists like Dr. Mark Lenner have spent decades meticulously excavating the Giza Plateau. They have found the workers' villages, the bakeries that fed the pyramid builders, the copper chisels, and the pottery shards dating perfectly to the Old Kingdom around 2500 BC. They have mapped the entire logistical supply chain of Pharaoh Khafre. But what they have never found anywhere on the Giza Plateau is a single piece of a tool, a single shard of pottery, or a single ancient campfire dating back to 10,000 BC. To a mainstream historian, the logic is inescapable. If a highly advanced civilization possessed the manpower, the logistics, and the engineering genius to carve a 240-foot-long, geometrically perfect lion out of the bedrock 12,000 years ago, they would have left a massive archaeological footprint. You cannot have thousands of workers operating a massive stone quarry without leaving behind a single broken hammer or a discarded meal. When alternative historians point to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to prove that Ice Age humans could build megaliths, the mainstream response is dismissive. They argue that just because humans in Turkey were building stone circles out of a completely different type of rock, utilizing completely different architectural styles, does not mean humans in Egypt were carving massive, perfectly proportioned lions. To them, drawing a line between the two sites is a massive, unscientific leap of faith. They demand local evidence, and at Giza, the local prehistoric evidence is completely zero. This brings us to the core of why the debate surrounding the Great Sphinx is so deeply emotional, so vicious, and so utterly deadlocked. We are not just watching a disagreement about a date. We are watching a violent collision between two completely different scientific disciplines. Geologists and climatologists look outward at the environment. They read the physics of the Earth. They see water erosion. They see climate cycles. And the rocks tell them a story of ancient rain and extreme age. Historians and archaeologists look inward at human progression. They read the evolution of tools, pottery, and texts. They see a slow, logical progression of Egyptian culture culminating in the Old Kingdom. and the human artifacts tell them a story of Pharaoh Khafre. Neither side speaks the other's language. To an Egyptologist, accepting the geological date of 10,000 BC means throwing away a century of established timelines, museum plaques, university textbooks, and their own life's work. It requires them to accept an invisible ghost civilization that left no physical trash behind. It is a psychological barrier known as paradigm paralysis, the absolute inability to accept new information because it completely destroys the established worldview. To a geologist, the Egyptologists are stubbornly clinging to an outdated timeline while ignoring the fundamental, undeniable laws of physics and erosion playing out right in front of their eyes. The Great Sphinx sits exactly on the fault line between these two warring sciences. But as we conclude our investigation, we have to step back from the academic shouting match and look at the monument for what it truly is. Whether it was carved by the ego of a pharaoh or left as a cosmic warning by the survivors of a dying world, the Stone Guardian has a final, powerful message for anyone willing to listen. Our journey across the Giza Plateau has taken us far beyond the dusty, settled pages of a standard history textbook. We didn't just look at a giant stone statue. We learned to read the literal language of the earth. We traced the deep, vertical scars of water erosion left behind by the relentless monsoons of the green Sahara, a climate that vanished long before the first pharaoh was ever born. We looked past the mismatched, tiny human head, a glaring anatomical paradox, and envisioned the magnificent, original lion gazing perfectly into its celestial counterpart, the constellation Leo, on the morning of the spring equinox in 10,500 BC. We shattered the illusion of a completely primitive prehistoric world by standing among the massive, intricately carved 20-ton pillars of Göbekli Tepe, proving that humanity was capable of breathtaking engineering at the exact end of the last ice age. We saw the radar anomalies hinting at hidden, geometric vaults buried deep beneath the Sphinx's paws, echoing the ancient myths of a hall of records. And we listened fairly to the orthodox academics, understanding their fierce defense of the 2500 BC timeline anchored in the slow destruction of salt weathering and the desperate need for physical, archaeological context. So, where does this leave us? Is the Great Sphinx 4,500 years old, or is it 12,000 years old? Perhaps the exact date is less important than the terrifying and beautiful truth the monument represents. If the alternative historians and geologists are right, human progress is not a guaranteed, upward straight line from cavemen to astronauts. It is a fragile cycle. The Sphinx stands as the ultimate survivor of a forgotten golden age, a highly advanced global civilization that was violently erased from the earth by the cosmic cataclysms of the Younger Dryas. They were masters of the stars and the stone, yet they were not immune to the absolute reset button of nature. The Great Sphinx still sits in the sand, silently enduring the millennia. It does not speak, but it actively challenges the sheer arrogance of our modern intellect. It asks us to look in the mirror. If an advanced civilization existed 12,000 years ago, only to be wiped out by a shifting climate and a cataclysmic flood, leaving behind nothing but an unrecognizable stone guardian, what will happen to us? When our modern world eventually passes into myth and the sands of time bury our cities, what massive, silent monument will we leave behind for the next cycle of humanity to find? As you drift off tonight, or as you ponder these ancient mysteries in your waking hours, keep looking up at the stars and keep questioning the ground beneath your feet. The history of our world is never truly settled. Thank you for listening.